a presença dos professores Claudine Haroche, do professor Iude, lá o Fernando, que tão prontamente responderam ao nosso convite. E eu vou passar logo em seguida a palavra à professora Cynthia Sarti, a vice-coordenadora da Cátedra do Arsaíde, que vai dar sequência a esse encontro. Well, good morning, everyone. As the coordinator of the Edward Said Chair, I'd like to begin by welcoming and thanking the presence of Professors Claudine Haroche and Professor Iude, Lau Fernando, who so readily accepted our invitation, and the presence of everyone. I pass the word to Professor Cynthia Sarti, the coordinator, also with me, the chair, and she will conduct the work and make the introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning and good afternoon for the ones who are not in Brazil. And well, this session is about vulnerability, and we have two presentations. First one, Professor Claudine Haroche from the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris, and Professor Iude Lau Fernando from the Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. And I would like to say that this presentation would be in English. Unfortunately, we could not translate simultaneously. And so what we have to say to the people who want afterwards in the discussion to make questions, that they can do this in Portuguese and we can translate to the authors, okay? Bom, eu queria dizer bom dia a todos que estão nos assistindo e eu queria apresentar essa mesa que cujo tema fundamental é a vulnerabilidade e será apresentada pelos professores Claudine Haroche, do Centro Nacional de Pesquisas Científicas de Paris, CNRS, e o professor Iude Lau Fernando, que é do Trinity College em Dublin, na Irlanda. E eu queria dizer que, infelizmente, nós não pudemos, os professores não falam português, então eles vão fazer a apresentação em inglês e, infelizmente, nós não pudemos fazer a tradução simultânea. Então, o que nós podemos oferecer é que quem quiser depois participar do debate, a gente apresenta no chat as perguntas que quiserem fazer e nós podemos traduzir aos expositores. Então, é isso, nós vamos dar início. Claudine and Iude, you have around 40 minutes, up to 50 minutes, if this is all right for you. And we can, if it's all right, Claudine starts and then Iude talks. Is that all right for you?
That's perfect.
Okay? Okay, then.
Thank you.
Claudine, you can start.
So, I did not give a specific title, but I could nevertheless say it's about vulnerability, of course, because this workshop is about vulnerability. And I am trying to make a connection between isolation and violence. How isolation is encouraging violence in a certain way. I take a psychoanalytical anthropological approach, referring in particular to some of the Freudian texts of the 30s, to those of the years also before the First World War, such as Pulsion et Destin des Pulsions, and a political and legal anthropological approach ranging from Arendt, Anders, to Legendre, and recently Supio and Chapoutot. It seems to me necessary to return to the question of le moi. Le moi is a French word which is very difficult to translate in English. An approximate translation is the self, but the self is not exactly le moi. Its original relation to the object, because both the self and the relation to the objects, the modes of subjectivation are now shaken, not to say called into question by the acceleration of digital technologies, the erasing of spatial and temporal limits of the limits between interior and exterior, between virtual and real, that they provoke. These modes of subjectivation are accompanied by a profound upheavals in the modes of aggregation, the regulation of distances and groupings in societies on the one hand, and the communities on the other, claiming to answer the need of protection, of belonging in the face of the profound isolation suffered by individuals. They may induce forms of tribalization that are often very violent. This leads to questions that now seem crucial to me. The social, political, and legal protections to which democratic societies have been trying to answer are experiencing, with the continuous expansion of, let's say, neo or ultra-liberalism, a decline or even an erasing of these protections, leading them to ignore the original and fundamental need for protection of every individual. These questions were raised at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century by authors who examined the question of the self, its weakness, or conversely, its uncontrolled omnipotence, in order to shed light and understand the transformation and upheavals, their sometimes unprecedented nature at work in today's world. The original fusion between subject and object will progressively give rise to a separation, producing effects on the psyche. This separation would now tend to be the acceleration, now in a state of fusion, at least of indistinction between object and subject. We have less real protection in the long run, fewer possibilities of shelter, neither external nor internal, against uprooting. With the decline in protection, we are seeing unlimited contacts that cannot prevent the isolation of individuals, which does not protect and does not encourage their singularity in any way. Other reactions that arise from isolation are negative and threatening on a social and political level, reactions of resentment, frustration, and humiliation that are sometimes expressed as repli identitaire, identity withdrawal. First, Strauss, Freud, and then Winnicott were for a long time attached to the original vulnerability of the little human being, to the ways in which he or she separates from one place to another through the formation of the self, du moi, of the object, on the other through the transitional object. Second, Max Weber examines the question of communities following Tönnies, who proposed the concept of community, Gemeinschaft, and society, Gesellschaft. Communities surround and protect the individual, and at the same time, they are likely to enclose him or her. Thus, there is an original precariousness, vulnerability, that of the human baby at birth, a need for social, political, and psychological protection, which the family and the community undertake in principle, to reduce or even feel a diffuse and generalized vulnerability that is now due to contemporary technologies and radicalizing tribalization. The current pandemic appears to be a typical ideal situation, increasing the physical, psychological, but also economical, social, and political vulnerability of isolated, confined, or neglected individuals, as state institutions and their laws are no longer able to provide them with a minimum protection. Hence, the need to return to the work of Supio and Chapoutot, who are committed to examining the decline in protection from a legal and political anthropological perspective. First, I would like to go into detail in the original formation of the borders of the self. In 1919, Tauscht published a work on their relationship to the object. He was one of the first to take an interest in psychic processes. He thus observed the emergence of the object, of a first object, and, I quote him, the infant seeks to grab his hands and feet as if they were objects foreign to him. Like Freud and later Winnicott, he stresses that the relationship to the object is a founding one, the object being a material object or an individual, a human being. Tauscht focuses on the question of schizophrenia, observing the loss of the limits of the self. And it is from this observation that he is going to ask a much more general crucial questions. What determines the formation of the borders of the self, which confers on the child the consciousness of a psychic unit, of a defined psychic personality? Tauscht points out that the beginning of the formation of the self implies, from the discovery of the object, created the awareness of the existence of an external world. Tauscht then evokes his agreement with Freud's hypothesis, according to which man's first renunciation is his renunciation of the protection of the maternal body. It was in 1923 that Freud observed the strengths and weaknesses of the self. He describes the function of the self as closely dependent on the system of perception, on the spatial representation we have of it. He will underline that uncontrolled movement will provoke fear, anxiety. The self can indeed be overwhelmed, even annihilated by the movement. Winnicott delivered in 1951 a theory of the elaboration and functioning of the self, of the individual. The self constitutes, I am quoting him, a unity with a membrane, delimiting an outside and an inside. Winnicott goes beyond the opposition between inside and outside. He then makes the hypothesis of a space of transition, a space, I am quoting him, which leads to escape from the confining interiority to escape. Winnicott also makes the hypothesis of the transitional object as the first possession, not me. He stresses that the movement of separation from the mother must be neither brutal nor complete. And it is precisely this point, neither brutal nor complete, that is crucial. It must be progressive in order to guarantee protection. Let's remember that the original object-subject fusion forms, if they are original, are not, however, permanent. The brutal distancing from the other or total adherence to the other, fusion, indifferentiation could produce similar effects of violence, radical responses leading to exclusion and rejection. Finally, he concludes that this is a paradox at work in, I quote him, the movement of separation between the world of objects and the self. He accepts it and does not try to resolve it. Winnicott prompts the question whether the self can always develop with an outside and an inside in continuity, despite the acceleration most often experienced in contemporary liquid societies, as Bauman referred to. Winnicott thus makes it possible to get closer to what is now called virtual reality, alongside the physical and material reality that can be apprehended by all. And the construction of an inner space that now seems to be lacking. Winnicott prompts us to ask ourselves whether we always have an outside and an inside in the virtual space of contemporary societies. What indeed constitutes now the subjective life in a world where the boundaries between real and virtual tend to fade away. I would like to come to a second point now, neutral or intrusive technologies for the psyche. These modes of separation would no longer be the same with the modes of perception imposed by the continuity of the technologies that surround us. They bring together and cancel out the distance, and at the same time can create an abyssal distance. The modes of separation between external and internal space of the self have been the subject of profound reflection by psychoanalysts and sociologists, such as Bauman recently. In all societies, the modes of coming close and distancing are subject to rules of civility, of civic-mindedness, to prevent fusional gatherings, or conversely, the violence of rejection and exclusion. Weber was one of the first to discern the role of modes of distancing and aggregation, as was Freud, who, with malaise in the culture, showed similar concerns. Let us recall that Freud stresses that the word culture designates all the achievement and device, I'm quoting Freud, which serve two purposes: the protection of man against nature and the regulation of the relations of men with each other. Freud insists on the decisive role of such an aid. I'm quoting him: if such an attempt were not made, these relations would be subject to the arbitrariness of the individual. It is the physically stronger would decide in the direction of his interest and impulsive motions. End of quote. In fact, he establishes that the common life of men, quote, is only made possible if there is a majority that is stronger than each individual. Freud sees in his replacement of the power of the individual by that of the community as a decisive cultural step. Its essence is that the members of the community limit themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the isolated individual knew no such limits. Laurence Kahn, who is a psychoanalyst and a philosopher, has recently returned to Freud's anthropological text, extended to contemporary issues. Kant observed that Freud reflects at great length on, I quote, the systems of impulsive limitation which are the very basis of culture. From this, can must be deduced, first of all, protections. Secondly, system of limitation. Here we must remember Freud's text, Impulses and the Destiny of Impulse, Pulsion et Destin des Pulsions. There is, I am quoting Freud, there is a primary hostility that never falls in the nature of humanity. The murderer is there, he is in civilized man. Freud saw it in him, in his sons who are at the front. Thirdly, system of derivation. All societies are the result of a system, a device, which is situated at the crossroads between horror and renunciation, is saying Laurence Kahn. She then warns, and I quote, if we simply repress this barbarity, the returns will be all the more devastating if we call them, whether we call them repression or regression. And this is where Laurence Kahn underlines the crucial role of measurement, of moderation. She underlines the importance of compromises that make it possible to live with this barbarity. And it is indeed, I would like to add, the question of the coronavirus that arises here, of course. A number of approaches, philosophical, anthropological, sociological, have undertaken to elucidate the future of the self, of the individual, when it merges with an injunction to identity. They extend what certain works had discerned in the 50s, those of Reisman, with the advent of the solitary crowd. The isolation is the rise of individualistic societies, those still seeing in democratic societies the coldness of anonymity, devoid of the warmth of belonging. Third point I would like to address now is about contemporary technologies induce upheavals in the functioning of subjectivity and the formation of the self. The conditions of formation of the construction of the modern individual of subjectivity presuppose, or at least presupposed, a certain relationship to time, a certain relationship to space, allowing the feeling of self-existence to be experienced, this feeling contributing to the establishment of forms of separation, as I said, and of proximity. In his last text, Bergson emphasized the spatial character of the representation of the inner life. It is in matter, in the antiquity of geometry and its authority, that he will discern the origin of the spatial representation of the inner life, of the interiority of the individual. According to Bergson, the foundation of the self finds their origins in the science of matter, which leads us to conceive of the self as fixed, unified, delimited. What becomes of the self, what Bauman praised about liquid societies, where the anchorage cannot be spatial. How to conceive, how to represent anchoring from now on? Can the self be formed, developed by perceiving and imposed continuity undergone equivalent to a continuous pressure, a continuity which, far from being defined by tradition and memory, is henceforth given over to an imposed technological continuity, imposed, of course, in a certain way. The separation between an interiority proper to the subject and an exteriority constituted by others would now tend to fade away, to give way to a continuous sensation devoid of meaning. This is what I had tried to show in L'avenir du sensible, A condição sensível, translated in Portuguese. Technologies, to the extent that they encourage the exposure of the most intimate feelings linked to each person's singular history, would be intrusive and disruptive. These technologies end up being accompanied by a centering on oneself that is inseparable from an inner impoverishment, the feeling of a loss of self, and an unlimited extension of sensoriality deprived of meaning. In his latest work, Bernard Stiegler gives a luminous definition of disruption. He sees it as a mechanism which, stemming from the obliteration of psychosocial systems, intensifies the process of disinhibition, a technical and psychosociological disruption, which is based on the destruction of all psychosocial structures, social organization. Stiegler draws the consequences. The destruction of identification and, before all, idealization processes are at the basis of consumerist capitalism. And he concludes that information and communication technologies that have become disruptive generate an immense suffering, a suffering which is symbolic, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual. And this is where Stiegler touches on the political question of neoliberalism alongside the psychic question of primordial narcissism. And I want to insist on a point, not so much the narcissism of small differences we have been listening to from psychoanalysts for ages, but the narcissism, the primordial narcissism. We understand the need for this in what are called processes of visible and insidious social, political, and economic exclusion on the borderline of the intangible, where without social existence, having nothing but oneself, an individual dependent is soon led far beyond uprooting from disaffiliation to the loss of belonging to the human species. Bauman confronts, in recent interviews on identity, he confronts the question of the self in liquid societies through identity, a central concept for any reflection on the contemporary world, considering that in a certain way, the history of modernity is also the history of a certain type of self. Technologies seem to cancel out, I told already, at distance, establishing permanent contact, and at the same time, an abyssal distance as an extension of the self. Technologies confer a threshold power accompanied by the psychic insecurity and diffuse anxiety. Can we speak of identity in the permanent change, which presupposes a certain stability of the self and the environment. Bauman even comes to wonder whether the universal, rational, undivided individual really ever existed. In his last text, Bauman notes that this division, I quote him, this division of humans into us and them has been throughout the history of the species an inseparable characteristic of the human mode of being in the world. Finally, like Weber, who saw a future threat from hostility in ethnic communal relations, he emphasized that, I quote him, the two elements of this opposition are negatively defined. Them are as not us, and us are as not them. Bauman concludes that this is what he calls a regression to the negation of the other. He concludes that it would be different, I quote him, it would be different not just quantitatively but qualitatively, as there is nothing to link it to the previous ones, whether it be family, tribe, clan, community, tradition. What Benjamin had visionary discerned about the mechanical reproduction of the work of art, one could say in general terms that the technique of reproduction detaches the object reproduced from tradition. And it is in a visionary manner that Bauman emphasizes that such a leap implies separating the issue of belonging from that of territoriality or political sovereignty. The crucial question remains unanswered. What outside boundaries, outside frameworks, is now likely to ensure belonging? The rooting of an individual in a singular history, a family of thought, those are questions. In conclusion, we have always been uncertain, but religion, paradise, the beyond, myths, beliefs, ideals were there to bring us comfort. The precariousness engendered by new technology is neither economic nor social. It is due to human poverty, which results from the rarefaction and impoverishment of relationships, relayed henceforth by the possibility offered by robots. What now brings us not comfort, but a pseudo-comfort, a false comfort. The social network, the modes of exhibition at work there, the anonymous forms of violence that unfold there are unleashed there. Let us take the example of the sniggering in this group called LOL, Laus, Out, Loudly. Hans Jonas, in For an Ethic of Futures, sees in the 27 publication of Heidegger, être étant, being, and I don't know the title in English, être étant, the major work of Heidegger, as an earthquake in the philosophy of our century. I quote Jonas, brought about the collapse of the entire model of consciousness and made the I who wants to appear in its place, the exaltation of the omnipotence of the eyes. It was a kind of choice of what Freud was saying at the same time, talking about weakness and power of the self. Jonas goes on to say that the model of substance disappears. Everything is, so to speak, still in progress, and what was previously called subject is now called being there. This infinitive, so general and abstract, becomes the technical designation of a specifically human being or even of the concrete individual. Should we see there, beyond the absence of commitment, the end of conscience, judgment, and responsibility? In The Principle of Responsibility, one of his other books, Jonas stresses that, I'm quoting him, responsibility is solicitude recognized as a duty towards another when his vulnerability is threatened. By striving to understand the upheavals at work, by continuing to think, by putting the present at distance through humor, the ability to withdraw, to distance oneself from fixed, verified identities, humor and hope, human worth. Can we and how resist these conditions of non-contact existence now in a world of extension and increase? To abstract oneself, to be in retreat, to withdraw, meaning to stand aside in thought, in thinking. Isolation induces a certain type of contact, neutral, cold, sometimes radical, devoid of nuances, of all human warmth. How to oppose the violence of radicality, both physical and psychological. Restoring or establishing, re-establishing the idea of measure in the sense of nuances, invalued, but above all, it can be the part of the inevaluable. The idea of nuance requires the acceptance of a relative imprecision. Globalization is therefore taking the dynamics of capitalism to its extreme, depriving human life of any guarantee and stability. And I want to refer at the end to Supio, who is saying the generalized insecurity of the conditions of human life gives rise in return to survival reflexes with their procession of xenophobic violence and appeal to the strong man who will know how to protect us and restore our confidence in ourselves. Thank you very much.
Be open to discussion. We're going to listen to Jude now, ok? Bom, só para avisar, antes de nós abrirmos a discussão, eu agradeci a professora Claudine, e antes de a gente abrir a discussão dos textos, a gente vai ouvir o professor Jude. Eu queria avisar a parte técnica que tem algumas pessoas que estão se comunicando aqui conosco que não estão conseguindo entrar. É o caso do professor Jens Baumgarten, que é um membro da cátedra também. Então, eu queria uma certa atenção para liberar a entrada das pessoas que estão tentando entrar. Tá? E o Jude, cadê ele? Caiu a conexão?
Sì, parece che le cayó en este momento. Ahí a gente está tentando ver cómo resolver.
Bom, vamos esperar um pouquinho.
Aí ele voltou. Está entrando.
Voltou? Tá certo.
Já pode pôr o PowerPoint dele aí.
O texto do professor Jude se chama Resistência ao Império e Militarização. Reivindicando, reclamando o sagrado. Clamando pelo sagrado. Né? Well,
thank you
back.
very much, Cynthia. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Yes.
Your title is Resistance to Empire and Militarization, Reclaiming the Sacred, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Now.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you, Howell, for the invitation. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. I was quite impressed by the way Claudine, brought together anthropological, psychoanalytical, and political perspectives together in the latter part of her reflection. Zygmunt Bauman's thoughts were highlighted. In my reflections, let me lay emphasis on the political side more, which I believe would complement what Claudine reflected so brilliantly. Now, let me first start with the title, Resistance to Empire and Militarization. The subtitle is Reclaiming the Sacred. First of all, this is really the title of a series of conferences which we organized. One in Mexico City, the other one was in Seoul in South Korea. Howell was involved in the Mexico conference. It brought together activists and scholars from different conflict zones in the world, ranging from Guam, Okinawa in the Pacific Islands, and then in South Asia, Kashmir, Tamil Elam in Sri Lanka and the Middle East, Palestine, and Ireland, and then Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico City, Brazil, okay, and then South Africa. Now, the whole purpose of the conference was to start a conversation, or to say a dialogue between activists who resist militarization, either based on their different faiths or mainly through their secular critical reflections. So that is one of the main goals of this series of conferences. The subtitle, in that the word empire and imperialism have been used interchangeably. Of course, we do not analyze militarization as a separate phenomenon from empire and militarization, empire and imperialism. Secondly, in this book, we do not analyze empire or imperialism and militarization in separation from capitalism and its different versions, neoliberal and ultra-neoliberal, as Claudine mentioned. So we always analyzed militarization and imperialism within the context of capitalism, not simply classical capitalism, but its different historical versions. I think Zygmunt Bauman focused, as Claudine mentioned, very much on the latest version of capitalism. One of my teachers, Francois Huttard, openly calls the present form of modernity as capitalist modernity. So that's a brief note about the main title. What about the subtitle? There were a lot of debates about using the word sacred because it can really border certain right-wing religious fundamentalist versions of the sacred. Fatherland, motherland, kind of sacredness. But we really wanted to reclaim even the word sacred. Here, the word sacred was used specifically to refer to the earth. We are not talking about another world. Secularum is sacred. The secular is sacred. So the Indologists like Raimondo Panica uses sacred secularity and secular sacredness interchangeably. The traditional weave of the world promoted by religions is that this world is going to pass away and there is a better world, which justified the status quo of this world. That is why Marx very openly called religion as the opium of the masses, because this world is going to pass away. But later we see that there was a greater consciousness about the importance of this world. And then it is in that sense we use the word sacred, particularly the sense of sacredness of the earth has surfaced very strongly today because of the emerging ecological consciousness. The planet is sacred. So capitalism has gone to such an extent to threaten the entire cosmic existence. Warfare today is not simply against the state and the Amazonia and its people. The warfare today that is necessitated by the latest version of capitalism is cosmic, it's planetary. So it is in that sense we use the word sacred. Let's reclaim the sacredness of the earth. Let's reclaim the sacredness of the cosmos, the Amazonia, the rivers, human relationships. And we could, in a way, subvert the idea of the sacred, in that way, reclaim the sacred. Because the main thing that modern capitalist logic has done is to desecrate the human body, and not only to alienate human beings, but also to atomize the human persona, feelings, body, consciousness, atomize and make it fragmented. So wholeness of the body within a society is desecrated, and then the body and the society's relationship with the earth is desecrated. So it is in that sense we really use the word the sacred. Now let me move to, this is basically the introduction. How am I going to connect empire and militarization? I mentioned that I would connect these two. What are the unique features of the modern empire? Of course, empires have been there all throughout human history. At one point in human history, it emerged. But there is something very unique in the modern empire. All of us are aware of it. the number one feature of the modern empire is it's a capitalist empire. Number two, capitalist empire is global. It's planetary. It covers the entire planet. No empire has covered the entire planet before the modern capitalist empire. Okay. Number three, Claudine mentioned this. This expansion of the empire cannot be made globally without militarization. And this militarization is not simply with gunboats or swords. It has taken technological heights. Technological heights. We talk about cyber attacks. We talk about drones. We talk about satellite monitoring missiles, target precision missiles. Of course, in the 80s, we had seen the film Star Wars. Okay? And we are seeing it today. Okay? So it has a highly technological level of militarization. It's not simply foot soldiers or armies. They are very secondary. The fourth point is, in the modern empire, we find not only technological brute force, but also psychological warfare. If you read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, it's very clear how psychological warfare is part of this militarization. And then Hitler, one of the British scholars, writes about cyber warfare, air warfare. So we find psychological warfare to advance technological brute force. In fact, no ancient war had an intergenerational impact. Modern wars do have an intergenerational impact. That's very different from what happened in the pre-modern period. It affects generation to generation. Okay. All the first 4 points can be called hardware. They are done with matter, the material. But hardware cannot be maintained. Hardware cannot be sustained without a software. The software is we call militarism. Militarism is the ideology. Within a society, justified through an economic reason, political reason, religious reason, that really gives the psychological, moral, perhaps spiritual justification to maintain the empire and militarization. So people have internalized it. That is why Bolsonaro won. That is why Trump won. Of course, we call them the ultra right-wing groups. What about the liberals? Liberals too have, in a way, covered the justification for militarization through their liberal logic. Their liberal logic of national security, border control, so on and so forth. Okay. If you see Obama, under Obama, we find large amount of people who have been deported from the US. He's nicknamed as Master Deporter. And you see under Macron what France is going through today. They are liberals. They don't look like Trump. They don't look like Bolsonaro. They don't look like Narendra Modi in India. They don't look like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. They don't look like Netanyahu in Israel. They look like decent liberal gentlemen. But through their so-called facade, they have covered militarism. So militarism always backs, justifies militarization and the capitalist empire. Now, in Western classical imperial period, Christianity backed it ideologically. But today, there is no one altar of the empire called Christian. There are multiple religious altars serving the same imperium. You find India, the Hindu altar is created, which is very much a part of the imperium today. The Zionist project in Israel is another altar. Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi version of religion is another altar. Of course, the US's Christian evangelical fundamentalism is the biggest altar here. And in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, you find a Buddhist altar. So you find this is militarism. So religious fundamentalisms are the new altars of this neoliberal militarized age. So you don't need one main empire like the US to invade another nation. The regional power blocks like the Saudi, like Israel, like Colombia, like Brazil, or like India, like Sri Lanka, like Japan, like Korea, they do the job. They do the job. Okay? But at the same time, there's a huge division being created between the faith communities. Jews versus Muslims, Christians versus Muslims, Hindus versus Muslims in India, Buddhists versus Muslims. Because each believe that they are masters on the earth. So one of the quotations that I have taken from the book, which I edited, is there is no single altar for sacrifice, but multiple altars that serve the same empire. There are many militarisms. Let's go forward. So these are the main features of the modern empire: capitalism, global planetary proportions, technological militarization, from psychological warfare to technological brute force, and militarism. Now, understanding the historical phases of the empire. The British Empire, which took over from Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, gave rise to the planetary empire. That's the classical period, as we know very well. Okay. Then we see there's a crisis in the empire, in the heart of the empire in Europe. And there's a crisis in East Asia, which imitated the empire, led by Japan. In Europe, in the second phase, we find Nazi regime in Germany and Japanese imperial regime in East Asia is colonizing Europe and Asia, respectively. Mohammed Mamdani from Princeton, in his beautiful book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, Roots of Terror, Cold War, America, writes, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting directly, what the Belgians did in Congo, what the Portuguese and the Spaniards did in Latin America, what the French did in Morocco, what the British did in India, Hitler was trying to do in Europe. Do you get it clear? Hitler was trying to do it in Europe. And then Japanese Imperial Army was trying to do it in East Asia. Okay? So that is the background to the Second World War, which really marks the second phase of the capitalist, development of politics and economics. And after the Second World War, the USA takes over from Britain the mantle, the crown of leading the empire. And then Soviet Russia, which was countering the US hegemony, was challenged by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As everybody knows, there was no need to bomb more Hiroshima or Nagasaki because the Japanese emperor had consented to surrender 6 months before bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why did the US bomb? The main reason was to tell Russia, we are superior to you. That was the main reason. Okay? So what happens politically is that USA is taking the lead after the Second World War. And we see then the phase of the Cold War, which in a way gave rise to nuclearization of the warfares. Okay? And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we see USA and becoming the only superpower. The only superpower. And it is at this moment in history, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan led the neoliberal economic onslaught under the code name, there is no alternative. There's no alternative. And with the end of the Cold War, we see, particularly after 2000 in the new millennium, there is a new move led by the US to encircle China. The US has already 8,000 small-scale, medium-scale, large-scale military bases, out of which 400 are located in Asia, all of which are encircling China. So that is where we find the latest version of neoliberal capitalism goes forward in a highly destructive way with the increase of military bases. Not only that, my last point is US, which is the main driver of the militaristic and capitalistic empire, has formed allies in India, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Japan, South Korea, Colombia. And during the last few months, the US also has forged new relationship with the Arab states, encircling Iran, and totally isolating Palestine. Okay? So this is the historical evolution of capitalism and the spread of militarization. In this, there are two features I would like to highlight. Capitalism has come to a point of totally destroying the state or narrowing down the function of the state, and thereby leaving the state totally just as a nominal entity, whereby there is no real value given to any citizen. What are the citizens' rights we have today? There are individual rights. You are reduced to survival instinct. It's only the passport that matters to cross the border. That is also for only those who have the passports within certain countries. But even in the so-called rich countries, you are either a client or a customer of a private insurance company, or a healthcare provider, or an educational institute, or a communication institute. So nothing that sustains life, as Claudine mentioned, nothing that sustains life is common. Healthcare is not common. Welfare is not common. So you are reduced to just an individual. Of course, Claudine mentioned beautifully how this individual, self has been constructed. And that is seen as the ideal. Of course, this is the cosmovision that is being presented to many people. And those who do not fall in line have to perish from the earth. Those who do not fall in line with this kind of vision and economic political agenda are being branded as rogue states, are being branded as undemocratic, authoritarian, or their elections are fraud, or they don't abide by human rights. So all these labels are being attached to those who resist. Let's move. This part I have already mentioned. Okay. In this phase of capitalist modernity, and then in this phase of militarization, militarism is, in a way, has created an Islamophobia. During the Cold War, it was anti-communism. But today, anti-communism has been replaced with Islamophobia. Instead of political values and convictions of democracy, freedom of the press, human rights, what we have here today is national security and global war on terror. And betrayal of national security is a capital crime. What is resistance now? I have broadly given some kind of an analysis of the empire, militarism, and militarization. What is resistance? Let me quote Judith Butler. After all, there are conditions under which war is waged, and we have to know them if we are to oppose war. Indeed, the opposition to war has to take place, in part, through remaking the conditions of its possibility and probability. Similarly, if war is to be opposed, we have to understand how popular assent to war is cultivated and maintained. In other words, how war waging acts upon the senses, so that war is thought to be an inevitability, something good, or even a source of moral satisfaction. So what Judith Butler tries to say is, in opposing the war, we have to identify the conditions that justify the war. And these conditions are psychological, mental, religious, cultural, okay, that create a kind of a militarism, okay, and justify it. And then let's move on. It is not enough to resist justification of war and its conditions. It is important to make a commitment to the conditions of livable life. One is to denounce war and oppose the conditions that justify the war. The other one is to build or reconstruct conditions so that life can be sustained. Life can be sustained. Now, I'm in a way summarizing and adding a few thoughts to Judith Butler. Life as such does not exist. Life doesn't exist as an abstract category. Life is always possible only under certain social and cultural conditions, not otherwise. Life is finite. We know that we don't live for 150 years. If it is so, it's great. Life is finite. We die. But life is not only finite because we die. Life is finite because there aren't proper social, economic conditions to sustain life. Therefore, finiteness or precariousness of life necessitates social life, collective life, cosmic life. Okay? What the neoliberal capitalist logic has done is to reduce humanity to a bunch of individuals, not as a social, not as a life that is part of a social ensemble. Okay? And in that, we find through militarization, some sections of life has been totally destroyed. By reducing, on the other hand, humanity to a bunch of individuals who are fighting for their survival, the others are being totally erased from the earth. So there are lives who don't exist at all. Grievable life and ungrievable life. Finally, we need to have a cosmovision, alternative cosmovision, and a socio-political structure that sustain life. Okay. Another point, quickly, the driving force behind resistance is not only opposition, but also the alternative liberating cosmovisions of the life and world. I think this is what Lula's period lacked. Reconstruction and keeping the conversation going on. Resistance should not simply reciprocate the language of the conquerors in order to authenticate the terms of resistance. And the language of resistance must be domestic, local, and definitive to the people who do the resisting. I'm quoting from Hamid Dabashi. In that, this is my reflection, the last point here, we have to resist framing the victims of neoliberal capitalism and militarization as individual victims. No. The liberal model in the Western Hemisphere reduces victims to individuals. Victims do have a collective identity. Refugees do have a collective identity. They are not statistics. We need to, in a way, reconstruct the identity of the victims as communities, as persons who are connected to different struggles, who carry a message. That is why there is a campaign here to say victims of war are messengers of peace. Or victims of war are not helpless bunch of individuals. Victims of war do have a collective political aspiration. Okay? So my last part here, I'll conclude here. The book which you saw has about 21 chapters. So each author comes from a particular struggle, a scholar, activist, from South Asia, from the Middle East, from East Asia. Okay. And you find from Japan, Korea, Sri Lanka. From Kashmir, Korea, Okinawa, Palestine, where women, for example, I'll give two examples here. In Kashmir, you find a majority of those who have been killed and made to disappear or are being imprisoned are men. Normally in Western academic literature, when they analyze conflicts, they look at women as simply helpless victims. But here, Farooq Fahim, a Kashmiri academic, writes how women have come to the forefront. Women are creating a big barrier between the military and the villagers. Women who used to cook at home now come and cook in public so that they can feed everybody in front of the military. So the traditional role has been changed and made it politicized. So it is different from Western understanding of feminism. Similarly, Sarah Ababne from Palestine writes how women exercise agency in Hamas-controlled Gaza. And similarly in Okinawa Islands, how alternative ways of living have been constructed mostly by women who are every day protesting against one of the biggest US military bases in Asia. There are 40,000 US Marines in Okinawa. 30% of the entire island has been occupied by the US military. And you find military battalions are sent to Korea, to Afghanistan, to Iraq from this island. So their resistance has a global significance. Okay. And then we also see here different religions have come together to discuss how they can resist religious fundamentalism and militarism. Okay. So let me see here again. This is from Latin America, from Ecuador, from Mexico, and from the Caribbean islands, how the scholars and activists have analyzed resistance to militarization. And yeah, let me conclude now with the final words, and then we find again from South Africa too. Yeah, it is slow to, okay. Conclusion. This is Arundhati Roy, who says, our strategy should be not only to confront empire, but to lay siege to it, to deprive it of its oxygen, to shame it, to mock it with our art, our music, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our sheer relentlessness, and our ability to tell our own stories, stories that are different from the ones we are being brainwashed to believe. Okay? And I just, because, you know, of my love for Brazil, I just end this, you know, conversation by, you know, reading one of the poems of Dom Helder Camara. This poem was written during the dictatorship in Brazil. Let me read it and finish it, okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that states that see national security as the supreme value are like Nebuchadnezzar, which is golden statue, that the king commanded to be adored? Adoration today consists in the idea that in defense of the supreme value, everything is permissible. Kidnappings, tortures, disappearances, murders. Everything is permissible to safeguard national security. Is this when one must be willing to be cast into the fiery furnace? Clearly, the Spirit of God inspires a new song that will encourage the victims of the idolatries of every age. Dom Helder Camara. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, for your presentation. Now we can open the discussion. Claudine now is disconnected. Bulgaria, can you ask her if she's going to come back? Bulgaria está sem som. Você está sem som.
Claudine is trying to connect me, but it's not possible in my... I will get out a minute to try to speak to her.
Now, but we have two questions. Maybe I could for you, from Denilson Marques dos Santos. He made the question. He said, the coloniality refers to a pattern of power that emerged as a result of modern colonialism. But instead of being limited to a formal relationship of power between two peoples of nations, it relates to how work, knowledge, authority, and intersubjective relations articulate with each other, right? Through the world capitalist market, and the idea of race. Introduced here, the idea of race. And then he says, the question is, how to think new epistemologies in the processes of destabilization of the state in new colonialism?
Last part, Cynthia, last wording, sorry.
How to think new epistemologies in the processes of destabilization of the state in new colonialism. Neo-colonialism.
Neo-colonialism, yes. Yeah, there is a distinction between colonialism and coloniality. Even after the formal colonial period is over, it is not only the colonial structures that exist, but also the colonial mentality, social, and the way we think, the way we relate. Okay, that is exactly what I said earlier on, that the cosmovision, that is reduction of humanity to a bunch of individuals, okay, is one of the features of coloniality, okay? One of the epistemologies which is very destructive. Okay? Now, in reconstructing, liberating epistemologies, okay, number one, it is the victims, really, who form the site of resistance. But we have to be very careful when using the word victims. Victims should not be romanticized, because they themselves can embrace coloniality. Okay? And they themselves can form constituencies of right-wing politics, secular or religious. It is this critically reflective praxis that has to be built with the victims, which demands, number one, critical analysis of not only colonialism, but also coloniality. And that is why I said, number two, that critical reflection of the praxis has to be done collectively within a given context. At the same time, third point, there's a danger to reduce the sites of resistance to local context alone. Whoever does the critical reflection has to connect the local to the global, the local to the global, local to the global. Okay? And that is very much needed. And last point, the fourth point is cosmovisions. Now, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, has this impressive project called Another Knowledge is Possible. Okay? Because we go through epistemicide, not only genocide, but epistemicide. Okay? So that is why alternative cosmovisions are important, which can be found amongst the indigenous people, which can be found amongst different religious traditions, okay, which can be found in secular humanist, okay, critical reflections. So there has to be a conversation. My last point is, at the moment, there's a big attack on every religious tradition on the one hand, and specifically on Islam. And then we also see very clearly a very, very strong attack on the indigenous communities in the world. Okay? So this is simply because that these communities carry throughout history a high level of alternative cosmovisions. There has to be a conversation about this more. So these are some of my thoughts.
Jude?
Yeah.
Did you conclude?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, because we have now a question for Claudine, and we have very little time. I'm sorry. Claudine, Ella, is she there?
Yes, she's there. She's hearing to us, but she can't appear.
So can I make the question?
Yes.
Okay. So we have two questions. Professora Olgaria said her question is, if the unprotection and precariousness are the source of moral values, as Freud wrote, how are human relations without the protections before guaranteed by the institutions such as the state that now cederam, that gave place to liberalism? And this is the question, Olgaria, put to you, Claudine. And I would like also to stress something that I think it's very important, since your reflection on the Condição Sensível, your book that was translated in Portuguese, and to understand, because there you were talking not only of the actual conjuncture of coronavirus, you were talking about the impact of technology in our lives. And I would like to stress the importance of the idea of life, both in Jude and Claudine exposition, which I think it's the point now in our resistance. We want to live. That's what's the question now. And so what I would like to tell you, Claudine, is I think you both put in a very important point, the question that what are at stake now is the relations between humans, because that's the point. Now, isolation just made much worse what was already in process. The cut, something that really put relations in a place, in an impossible place. It's the individual, focus on the individual, the technology, and all this that the coronavirus only came to make worse. But it's something that in the process that Jude said in a very broad way, and that Claudine said, focused on the impact on the self of the process that Jude in a very large way put. And I think what you're talking is about the difficult of relations in this moment. So the question is addressed to both of you in a sense. Claudine, can you talk? Can you answer? I don't know if it was clear, the questions. Claudine, can you talk?
Ela não está aqui, Cynthia, conectada.
Oh, que pena.
She's saying that she's not hearing anymore.
Well, do you want to say anything else? Just, I think we have like 5 minutes. Do you want to say anything else, Jude, and then we can finish the session? We're not listening to you. The sound is not on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for, I saw the interconnection between what I said and what Claudine said. Mm-hmm. The self, yes. the self and us, and there is no self without us, so that interrelationship has to be reconstructed, and that is the whole task. The liberal answer has badly failed. it has to be a liberating answer. Okay? Reforms have badly failed. It has to be a transformative step. I'm using these words, with a particular meaning. So point one here is in the reconstruction process is to see how connectivity, without connectivity, okay, between human persons and the conditions that promote connectivity, we cannot move forward. Okay? So even the smallest initiatives that create conditions that make people connect are very, very important these days, I would say. Very, very important. And so that, because we cannot move on only with oppositional politics. It is important. But those who lead oppositional politics should also have propositional politics. Propositional politics that connect. For example, you can imagine what happened in Arab Spring. Arab Spring was oppositional. And then there was no proposition. There was no alternative proposition except in Tunisia. Okay, there was no proposition to reconstruct the society, to reconstruct gender relationships, to reconstruct ecological relationships. Okay, so I think this has to be the critique of course, one would say Lula's regime is better than Bolsonaro. Another would say Obama is better than Trump. We should get rid of this comparison, We should get rid of this comparison. For example, this is my last point. Let's say, Macron came to power in France, opposing Marine Le Pen, who is very right-wing. Okay? And then Macron has taken some of the slogans of Marine Le Pen today, and then asking the same French people to vote him, okay, back to power, saying, oh, Marine Le Pen is coming. But on the other hand, Marine Le Pen's right-wing politics in France came to the fore when Macron was in the cabinet as the finance minister. So this difficult, challenging, position is something that many don't want to take. Neither the liberals nor the right wings. Right wing is very clear, but we don't say neither the liberals. So that is where the local initiatives that connect people to people are extremely important. So this is my last comment. Yeah.
Okay, we have to finish.
Agora tá com som.
Tá ouvindo? Tá. Now I just said that local relations that connect lives. I think that's the point. And well, we have to finish. We've passed 15 minutes already from our time. So I'm going to finish this session, and we are going to be back in 20 minutes for the next session.